Ethan sat in the middle of a vast flower field, surrounded by wild flowers of every color: red poppies, yellow daisies, and delicate white lilies. The gentle breeze made the petals dance, and the warm evening sun bathed everything in a golden glow. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, a hidden world where silence spoke louder than words. This was Ethan's special place, a secret escape from the busy world. Here, in the heart of nature, he could breathe freely. He had discovered this field years ago, back when he was just a boy, running through the tall grass without a care. Now, as a man, he still found comfort here. But today, something was different. Today, his heart felt heavier than usual. Ethan had always been a quiet soul, a man who found beauty in solitude. He wasn't afraid of being alone. He had learned to live with it. But lately, the loneliness had started to feel unbearable. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that came from being without company. It was the kind that came from missing someone. Someone who was once a part of his life but had disappeared, leaving behind only memories. He closed his eyes and let out a slow breath, his fingers grazing the soft petals beside him. The flowers had witnessed his happiest moments, and they had also seen his pain. They knew the truth, the way his heart still longed for something, or perhaps someone, he could not name. The world beyond this field had moved on. People rushed through life, chasing dreams, building futures. But Ethan remained here, stuck in the past, unable to move forward. His heart carried an ache that time refused to heal. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying a faint scent of wildflowers. He tilted his head back, letting the sun's last rays warm his skin. The sky above him was a painting of soft pinks, oranges, and purples, a masterpiece that nature created every evening. But tonight, even its beauty couldn't bring him peace. Just as he was lost in thought, something broke the silence, the sound of footsteps, soft, hesitant, moving through the flowers toward him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. No one ever came here. This place was his sanctuary, his secret. He wasn't expecting company. He wasn't sure if he wanted it. He turned his head slowly, his eyes searching through the tall grass. The footsteps grew closer, steady but unhurried. Then he saw her. A woman dressed in a simple white dress that swayed with the wind was walking toward him. Her long hair flowed over her shoulders, catching the last light of the sun. There was something graceful about her, something almost unreal, as if she belonged to this field as much as the flowers did. For a moment, Ethan simply stared, unsure if she was real or just a trick of his imagination. But as she came closer, he could see her face more clearly. There was something familiar about her, something that made his heart tighten in a way he didn't understand. She stopped a few steps away from him, tilting her head slightly, as if studying him. Her lips curved into a soft smile. "Are you lost?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet, uncertain. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around, her gaze sweeping over the field, taking in its beauty. Then her eyes met his and she spoke. "No," she said, her voice calm, almost knowing. "But maybe you are." Ethan frowned slightly, confused by her words. But before he could ask what she meant, the wind picked up, making the flowers sway around them. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And deep inside him, for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir, a feeling he thought he had forgotten. Ethan remained seated among the wildflowers, his heart beating a little faster than before. The woman before him stood gracefully, her dress swaying slightly in the breeze. The golden light of the setting sun cast a soft glow on her face, making her look almost unreal, like a dream formed from the colors of dusk. He had been coming to this field for years, yet no one had ever wandered here before, until now. It felt strange, almost as if fate had sent her to disturb his solitude. But why? Who was she? The way she looked at him made him uneasy. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made him feel exposed, as if she could see into the deepest parts of him that he kept hidden from the world. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. The woman smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "No," she said. "But maybe you are." Her answer made him frown slightly. It was an odd thing to say, and yet there was something in her voice, something gentle but firm, that made him pause. Was he lost? In a way, yes. Not physically, but in his heart. Ethan studied her closely. Her long hair cascaded over her shoulders, catching the evening light. Her eyes held something familiar, though he couldn't place where he had seen them before. He was sure he had never met her, and yet there was a strange feeling in his chest, like his heart recognized her before his mind did. "How do you know that?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow step forward and lowered herself to sit beside him. Ethan stiffened for a moment, unsure how to react. He wasn't used to company here. This place had always been his alone, a retreat from the rest of the world. And now here she was, sitting so close that he could feel the warmth of her presence. For a while, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the tall grass, the sound blending with the distant chirping of crickets. The sun was lower now, its colors deepening into richer shades of orange and red. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Do I know you?" The woman turned her gaze toward him, her eyes filled with something unreadable. "Do you?" she asked softly. He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Something about her was unsettling in a way he couldn't describe, not because she frightened him, but because she made him feel something, a feeling that had been buried for a long time. She reached out and gently touched one of the wildflowers beside them, running her fingers along the delicate petals. "This place is beautiful," she murmured. "It feels untouched, like a memory that never fades." Ethan watched her closely. "It's special to me." She smiled again, but this time there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I can see that." A silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made words unnecessary. Then, without looking at him, she asked, "Why do you come here?" Ethan hesitated. He had never spoken about it to anyone before, but for some reason, the question didn't feel intrusive coming from her. It felt natural. "To think," he said simply, "to escape, to remember." She nodded as if she understood. "Memories can be heavy, can't they?" He looked at her, surprised by how easily she put into words what he had felt for so long. "Yes," he admitted. She turned to him again, her gaze soft but intense. "And do you ever feel like some memories never really leave you? Like they wait, just beneath the surface, for the right moment to return?" Ethan's chest tightened. The way she spoke, the way she looked at him, it was almost as if she knew exactly what he had been carrying in his heart all these years. Before he could respond, the wind picked up again, rustling the flowers around them. The air smelled of earth and petals, fresh and nostalgic all at once. Ethan wanted to ask her more, who she was, why she had come here, why she spoke as if she understood him in ways no one else did, but before he could find the words, she spoke again. "Sometimes," she said, "we think we've lost something forever, but maybe it's just been waiting to be found." And with that, she looked at him one last time, long and deep, before turning her gaze back to the sunset. Ethan sat in silence, his heart beating unsteadily. He didn't understand what was happening, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, a feeling he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Ethan stared at the woman sitting beside him, his mind racing with questions. There was something about her, something familiar yet distant, like a song he had once loved but forgotten the melody of. She spoke with such ease, her words carrying an understanding of him that no stranger should have. His heart beat faster as he studied her face. The soft evening light illuminated her features, the curve of her lips, the depth of her eyes, the way her hair fell around her shoulders. He knew her. He was sure of it now. But how? The thought gnawed at him as the silence between them stretched. Finally, he found his voice. "Do I know you?" The woman turned to him, her gaze steady. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and plucked a small white flower from the ground, twirling it gently between her fingers. She smiled softly, as if she had been waiting for this question. Then she spoke. "Do you remember me, Ethan?" The sound of his name on her lips sent a shiver through him. There was something about the way she said it, something that made his heart tighten. His breath caught as he searched her face again, looking for the answer he knew was buried deep in his memories. And then it hit him. Ava. The name formed in his mind before his lips could shape it. A rush of emotions surged through him, shock, disbelief, hope. It couldn't be. Ava. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if saying her name too loudly would make her disappear like a dream. She nodded, her expression softening. It's been a long time. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Ava. The girl he had once loved. The girl who had been his whole world before she vanished without a word. The girl he had spent years trying to forget, only to realize he never really could. He swallowed hard, his thoughts a tangled mess. How was this possible? Ava sighed, her fingers still playing with the flower she had picked. Life took me away, she said quietly. My family moved suddenly. I had no choice. Ethan's jaw tightened. But you didn't even say goodbye. Her eyes flickered with something, regret, pain. I wanted to, she admitted. But everything happened so fast. One day I was here, and the next I was gone. Ethan looked away, his fingers curling around a blade of grass. The field, once a place of peace, now felt heavy with memories. He had been just a boy when Ava left, but the pain of her absence had stayed with him for years. He had waited for a message, a letter, anything to explain why she had disappeared. But there had been nothing, just silence. I thought I lost you forever, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Ava's hand reached out hesitantly, her fingers grazing his. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent a wave of warmth through him. You never lost me, Ethan, she whispered. He turned to look at her, his heart hammering. The years had changed them both, but in this moment it felt as if nothing had changed at all. She was still Ava, the girl who used to sit beside him in this very field, dreaming about the future. The girl who used to laugh with him, run through the flowers with him, hold his hand under the starlit sky. The girl he had once loved. And now here she was, back in the same place where it had all begun. Ethan searched her face for answers. Why now? Why after all this time? Ava's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but she hesitated. She looked down at their hands, her fingers now fully resting against his. Because I needed to find you again, she said softly. Ethan's breath hitched. And now that you have. Ava lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes shining with something unspoken. Now, I don't want to lose you again. The wind whispered through the flowers, carrying their past between them. And in that moment Ethan knew. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how much pain had lingered, his heart had never stopped waiting for her. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he processed Ava's words. Now, I don't want to lose you again. For years he had carried the weight of her absence, burying his pain beneath the quiet solitude of this field. He had forced himself to move on, convincing himself that she was nothing more than a memory. But now, with her sitting beside him, her hand lightly resting against his, the truth became painfully clear. He had never truly let her go. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Ethan turned to her, his voice quieter than before. Where did you go, Ava? Ava sighed, running her fingers through the petals of a nearby flower, her touch delicate, almost hesitant. I told you, she said softly. My family moved. It wasn't planned. My father got a job in another city, and before I knew it, we were packing everything and leaving. Ethan clenched his fists in the grass, the frustration of all those lost years bubbling to the surface. Then why didn't you tell me? His voice was sharper now, filled with the emotions he had kept buried for so long. Why didn't you write, call, anything? Ava winced at the hurt in his voice, her gaze dropping to their hands. I wanted to, Ethan. I tried. She exhaled shakily. But things weren't that simple. My parents didn't want me holding on to the past. They thought it would be easier if I just let go. Ethan's chest tightened. And did you? She shook her head. No. Her answer was immediate, firm. She looked up at him then, and in her eyes he saw it. The same ache, the same longing, the same unspoken words that had lived inside him for so long. I never let go of you, Ethan, she whispered. Not once. His breath caught, the world around them suddenly feeling smaller, as if the space between them was the only thing that mattered. For so long he had believed that she had forgotten him, moved on without a second thought. But now, hearing the truth from her own lips, a different kind of pain filled him, the pain of time wasted, of moments that could have been. Ava, his voice was softer now, the anger fading into something else, something raw. I waited for you. Ava's fingers curled slightly, as if gripping the memory of the years they lost. I know, she murmured, and I hate that I wasn't there. I hate that I left you without saying goodbye. But I was just a girl back then, Ethan. I didn't know how to fight for us. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. He understood. He really did. They had been young and life had been unfair. But it didn't erase the fact that he had spent years aching for her, believing she had forgotten him. He looked at her again, his gaze searching hers. Why now? Ava hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. Because I finally had the choice, she said. I spent years thinking about coming back, but something always stopped me. Fear. Uncertainty. The thought that maybe you had moved on. But then, she swallowed. Then I realized that if I didn't come back now, I might regret it forever. Ethan's heart clenched at her words. Could he really blame her for being afraid? Hadn't he been afraid too? Even now, as she sat beside him, part of him wanted to push away the hope that was rising in his chest. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter. She reached for his hand again, this time holding it fully, her fingers intertwining with his. Do you still love me, Ethan? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His heart slammed against his ribs. The question was simple, yet it carried so much weight. He had spent years pretending he had moved on, but deep down the answer had never changed. He stared at her, at the girl who had once been his whole world, the girl who, despite everything, still held his heart in her hands. I never stopped, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Ava let out a shaky breath, her eyes glistening in the fading sunlight. Then, with a small, trembling smile, she whispered, "Neither did I." And in that moment, under the soft glow of the setting sun, the years of separation, of silence, of pain, everything melted away. The world around them seemed to fade as Ethan and Ava sat in the middle of the wildflowers, their hands still intertwined. The sun had almost disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and pink in the sky. The air was cooler now, but neither of them moved. It was as if the field, the sunset, and the quiet evening had wrapped them in a moment that neither of them wanted to break. Ethan still couldn't believe she was here. After all these years, after all the nights he had spent thinking about her, wondering where she was, if she had forgotten him, she was sitting right beside him, holding his hand, telling him that she had never stopped loving him. It felt unreal. It felt impossible. And yet here she was. Ava squeezed his hand gently, pulling him back to the present. "Ethan," she said softly, "say something." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. This doesn't feel real." Ava smiled, tilting her head slightly. "It's real," she whispered. "I'm here." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. She wasn't the same girl he had fallen in love with all those years ago. She had changed. Her features more mature, her eyes carrying stories he hadn't been a part of, but at the same time she was still Ava. The way she smiled, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way her fingers absent-mindedly played with the petals of the flowers around them, it was all the same. He had spent so much time trying to forget her, but now he realized that he had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for her. Ava's gaze softened as she studied his face. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. Ethan swallowed, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. "I'm afraid." She frowned slightly, her fingers tightening around his. "Afraid of what?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Afraid that this is just a dream," he admitted. "Afraid that I'll wake up tomorrow and you'll be gone again." Ava's expression turned sad, and she reached up to touch his cheek, her fingertips brushing his skin lightly. "I'm not going anywhere, Ethan," she whispered. "Not this time." His heart clenched at her words, the sincerity in her voice wrapping around him like a warm embrace. He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. "Ava." He hesitated, searching her face for answers. "How do we do this? How do we pick up from where we left off after so many years?" She let out a soft laugh, her thumb tracing small circles on the back of his hand. "We don't," she said. "We start again." Ethan's chest tightened at the simplicity of her answer. Could it really be that easy? Could they really just start over, as if the years apart had never happened? He wanted to believe they could. Ava must have seen the hesitation in his eyes because she smiled gently. "We don't have to have all the answers right now, Ethan. We don't have to figure out everything in one night." She exhaled softly. All I know is that I found my way back to you. And I don't want to waste any more time." Her words settled deep in his heart, melting away the last traces of doubt that had been holding him back. He had spent years living in the past, holding onto a love that he thought he had lost forever. And now that love was sitting beside him, looking at him with the same warmth, the same tenderness, the same unspoken promises. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was warm beneath his touch, her breath catching as his fingers traced along her jaw. "Ava," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, leaning into his touch. And when she opened them again, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only love. Ethan didn't think. He didn't stop to question. He just leaned in. And as his lips met hers, the years of longing, the pain of separation, the fear of the unknown, it all faded into nothing. All that remained was them. Ethan's lips met Ava's in a kiss that felt like both a memory and a new beginning. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if testing the reality of it. But the moment their breaths mingled, the past and present crashed together in a storm of emotions neither of them could contain. Ava melted into him, her fingers threading through his hair, pulling him closer as if she were afraid he might disappear. Ethan responded in kind, his hands holding her face gently but firmly, as if trying to memorize the way she felt beneath his touch. The kiss deepened, growing warmer, more desperate, years of longing spilling into each touch. It was a kiss of love lost and love found, of stolen time and second chances. The taste of her, the way she fit against him, it was everything he remembered and more. But then slowly they pulled apart, breathless, their foreheads resting against each other's. The night air was cool, but Ethan felt nothing but warmth. Ava let out a small, shaky laugh. I wasn't expecting that." Ethan smiled, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Neither was I," he admitted. "But I don't regret it." Her eyes softened, shining under the silver glow of the rising moon. "Neither do I." For a long moment they just sat there, surrounded by the whispering flowers and the quiet hum of the night. The world felt distant, like it had shrunk to just the space between them. Ethan traced slow circles on the back of her hand, his thoughts spinning. "Ava, what happens now?" She exhaled, her eyes drifting to the stars. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I do know one thing. I don't want to lose you again." He felt his chest tighten at her words. "You won't," he promised. "Not this time." Ava turned to look at him again, something vulnerable flickering in her gaze. "Are you sure? After everything?" Ethan nodded, tightening his grip on her hand. "I spent years missing you, Ava, wondering where you were if you ever thought of me. Now that I have you here, I'm not letting go." Ava smiled, though there was still a trace of hesitation in her eyes. "It won't be easy," she murmured. "We've both changed. Our lives are different now." He sighed, understanding the weight of her words. "I know. But I also know that some things don't change." She tilted her head slightly. "Like what?" He gave her a small, knowing smile. "Like the way I feel when I look at you." Ava's breath hitched, and she blinked, as if trying to hold back the emotions welling up inside her. "Ethan." "I mean it," he said firmly. "No matter how much time has passed, no matter what's different now, I still love you." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling. "I love you too." Ethan lifted a hand to gently wipe away the tear, his touch lingering on her cheek. "Then we'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." Ava nodded, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. She glanced at the flowers around them, her fingers grazing the petals absent-mindedly. "You always loved this place," she whispered. Ethan chuckled, looking around the familiar field. "Yeah. It always felt like home." Ava smiled, her eyes locking onto his. "Maybe it wasn't the place," she said. "Maybe it was who you were waiting for." His heart skipped a beat at her words. She was right. This place had always been special to him, but now he understood why. He hadn't just been coming here to think, to remember. He had been coming here because a part of him had always hoped she would find her way back. And now she had. The night stretched before them, endless and full of possibilities. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, none of that mattered. Because in this moment, in this field of flowers, they had found each other again. The night stretched around them, quiet and endless, as Ethan and Alva sat in the heart of the flower field. The moon bathed them in silver light, and the stars twinkled above like they were watching over them. It was a perfect night, one that neither of them wanted to end. Ethan held Ava's hand in his fingers tracing gentle patterns against her skin. Even after everything, the lost years, the silence, the questions, this moment felt right. It felt like home. Ava sighed softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "Do you think we can really do this?" she asked. Ethan turned slightly, pressing a light kiss to the top of her head. "I do," he said without hesitation. "I think we've waited long enough." Ava smiled, but there was still a hint of doubt in her eyes. "It scares me, Ethan," she admitted. "Loving you again. Letting myself believe that this time nothing will take us apart." Ethan tightened his grip on her hand. "I won't let anything take you away from me again, Ava. I promise." She lifted her gaze to his, searching his face for reassurance. "And if life tries? Then I'll fight for us," he said, his voice firm. "Like I should have before." Ava let out a small, trembling laugh. "You don't have to fight alone." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling at her words. "Good," he whispered, "because I don't ever want to." The cool night breeze ruffled their hair, carrying the scent of wild flowers around them. For a while, they simply sat there, wrapped in the silence, in the warmth of each other's presence. The years of separation had stolen so much from them, but here, in this moment, they had everything they needed, each other. Ava shifted slightly, tilting her head up toward him. Her eyes gleamed in the moonlight, filled with something tender, something unspoken. "Ethan?" "Yeah," he murmured, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. She hesitated for a second before speaking. "Kiss me again." His breath hitched at her words, his pulse quickening. He had been thinking about kissing her again since the first time their lips had met earlier that evening. Now, with the night around them, with the promise of a future lingering between them, he didn't hesitate. He cupped her face gently, his fingers brushing against her jawline as he leaned in. Ava closed her eyes just before their lips met, surrendering to the moment. The kiss was slow, deep, filled with all the things they hadn't said, all the love they hadn't been able to share over the years. It wasn't rushed, it was patient, as if making up for all the lost time. Ava sighed against his lips, melting into him as his arms wrapped around her. She felt safe, cherished. This was where she was meant to be. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he murmured again, as if needing to remind her to remind himself. Ava smiled, her fingers lightly tracing his cheek. "I love you too." Ethan exhaled, feeling something deep within him settle. It wasn't just relief, it was peace. A kind of peace he hadn't known in years. Ava looked around the field, her eyes thoughtful. "I used to dream about this," she admitted softly. "About coming back here. About finding you again." Ethan chuckled. "And?" She turned back to him, her smile full of warmth. "It's better than I ever imagined." He kissed her temple, his heart swelling with love. "So what now?" Ava grinned, her fingers intertwining with his. "Now, we make up for lost time." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Sounds like a good plan." As they sat beneath the moonlight, holding each other close, the past no longer mattered. The years apart, the pain, the unanswered questions, all of it had led them here. And here, in the middle of the flowers, in the arms of the person they had always belonged to, they knew one thing for sure. Love, real love, never truly fades. It waits patiently until the time is right. And now, their time had finally come.